everybody. Welcome to the first in a series of open webinars from the International Ecopsychology Society. The IES mission is to support and strengthen the spread of psychopsychology and connect professional students from the field in all parts of the world for mutual enrichment. The IES exists in 14 countries and will soon be represented in 6 more. Today's webinar, it's free to the public and our representatives will be Julianne Skai Arbor, also known as the TreeGirl, who is an award-winning author and the IES Co-Representative for the US along with Dr. Tina Fields. Julianne's work focuses on bringing people into allyship with the earth through forest ecotherapy. This talk has the title Ecological Identity and Survival, addresses our current collective psychological identification during the pandemic with the survival of our civilized human selves versus our collective ecological selves.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share with you some thoughts and questions I have about the virus in an ecopsychological context. The title of my presentation is Ecological Identity and Survival. Hello, fellow humans. Just a reminder of where we are in the universe. Here we are on planet Earth in all its complexity, going from the macrocosm of the universe down to the microcosm of planet Earth and all of the many life forms that live here. So of all life on planet Earth, human beings are just one species out of millions of species. In fact, they don't even know how many species there are. And this diagram here shows how life on Earth is divided up into categories and according to biomass. So according to this diagram, as you can see, plants and trees make up the majority of life on Earth. And if you look over here in this little sliver right here, that is viruses, very small because they're microscopic. And then right next to viruses here, we have animals. And if you go over here to this section over here, here we have all of animals divided up. And here we are humans because humans are mammals. And as you can see, humans are only 0.06% of the entire biomass of the planet. So we're a very small percentage, although we are a very important one in that we have the greatest impact of any species. And survival is a fundamental physical and psychological mechanism shared by all living beings. It depends on getting basic needs met, such as food, water, shelter, safety of the physical body and the psychological, psychic body. And survival requires resiliency to overcome threats to existence. Now, this is true for all life on Earth. All life shares a common will to live. I'm going to talk about the two different identities that humans have. One is our civilized human identity. Now, this is modern human in the industrial age and different from our ancestors. Then our other identity is our ecological identity, our identity as part of Gaia or planet Earth. Our civilized human identity views our species in an anthropocentric way, meaning human-centered, or in a hierarchy, that humans are the most important species on the planet. We primarily function from a state of ego, or the perception of self versus other. Our mind is the dominant faculty that we use. And modern civilized humans are prone to more psychological disorders than our ancestors, such as anxiety, depression, obsession, narcissism, etc. Our perception of the world from our ecological identity is in an ecocentric paradigm, meaning the earth is one interconnected living system without hierarchy. In this view, there are no others. And instead of the mind, we function intuitively from our heart, somatically with our bodies, and our spirit or soul all integrated together. And we're prone to ecstatic states of interconnection with all life. Our civilized human identity has its own state of survival. And in this modern technological age, and this particular photo shows someone most likely from the overdeveloped world, has a lot of stresses, has a lot of things to juggle and to think about, things that maybe our ancestors didn't have to think about. And so we're constantly in a state of survival just to keep up with the insanity of the modern world. And then on top of it, now there is this pandemic. There's the virus, and then there's all the protocol about how to stay alive. Now, partially what this talk is about is to remind everybody that our house is still on fire. Do you remember that? Do you remember that when the Amazon was burning, the phrase, our house is on fire, or my house is on fire, and it turned into a greater statement in terms of climate change, that our house, the planet, our home is on fire, literally on fire. And so what happened to that? That sort of fell into the background, but it's still on fire. So my question is, are we modern civilized humans in an obsessive state of self-distraction with the pandemic? Is our collective civilized identity, are we psychologically absorbed with the threat of the virus? And is that a distraction from the ecological crisis? We seem to be all caught up in watching the media and watching the news and listening, and we seem to be hypnotized over this. And as many of us know, media and computers and many things in modern civilization can be seen as a distraction from what really, really is important. Of course, that's where we get our information in this modern age. But I just ask you to question yourself, how much of this is a distraction? Let's look at the archetypes of the human psyche. The virus right now is taking the position of death in our psyches. The virus equals death, and death is a very, very powerful archetype across human consciousness. It has symbols that we think of, like the Grim Reaper, and the color red especially we associate with danger and emergency and fear. So is it any wonder that the Center for Disease Control, when they created the icon, the symbol for COVID-19, that they painted this symbol red? Because automatically we will pay attention that something might be dangerous, something might be poisonous. I should pay attention. I should stop at the stop sign. There's some emergency going on. So what's interesting is that viruses are actually gray in color. They're colorless. They have no reason to have any color in their microscopic world. In the bigger macrocosmic world of nature, usually poisonous frogs and insects will display a bright color, or perhaps an animal will display a bright color to get attention or to warn. So just to take note that this image, which is now burned into the human psyche and those like it, is now burned into the human psyche of just about every human being on the planet that's able to see it, that's perceiving it. So it's now become like part of a neurotransmission system in our brain. We identify with it, and we have for months and months now. Now, also interesting is that the COVID virus icon, but it kind of has this creepy feeling of something out of Star Wars or a science fiction movie, some, you know, Death Star or some alien invader that is going to attack us. So that is also very much part of the psychology of the pandemic. Another archetype of the psyche is war. Now, pretty much every generation of humanity has, since the beginning of humanity, has seen some form of warfare or battling. That war, the state of heightened anxiety and threat and fear and defensing, that is burned into our psyches as well, into human consciousness, that of war. And right now, humanity is at war with this microscopic being on the planet and is taking the position of warrior. Warrior is also an archetype, which is alive and well all over the world in the military. So war and the warrior is very familiar with us. Even if you and us and certain of us have never actually experienced war as a soldier, it's burned into our psyches, and there is a, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder ingrained in our DNA of, in terms of fight or flight, of somebody, something attacking us, and we have to save our lives, and we have to get up our energy and fight for survival. So even the cartoons that they're putting out in the media and in hospitals and to teach children about the virus is put in this very iconic, symbolic, archetypal visual of battling the virus as an other, as something outside of ourselves, as opposed to something that's part of the greater system. Another archetype you're all familiar with is of the planet itself, of Gaia, the goddess Gaia, goddess of life. And we associate Gaia with oneness and the divine feminine, very nurturing, with inherent wisdom, the mother of all life. And goddesses all over the planet since the beginning of human consciousness have had a female goddess that represents birth and life and rebirth and transformation, as well as destruction and death. Many goddesses are also destroyers, the creator destroyer. And certainly planet Earth, we all recognize that in planet Earth. It's a very volatile planet with earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes, and but there is a sense of change, constant change, as part of life, and that is sacred. Gaia and the goddess of life and earth as the mother of all life, the source, the resource, and a symbol of emergence, constantly emerging and changing and transforming. So that archetype is very much in ourselves, especially in the female gender, because everyone has had a mother unless you're born in a test tube. Another archetype of the psyche is the tree of life, or the cosmic tree, or the world tree. And this is an archetype that has been found in artwork all over the planet for thousands of years. Wherever there were trees, people would draw trees and have symbolic relationships with them and rituals around trees, because trees are a symbol of interconnection of the upper and the lower and the middle world and the tree of life and everything intertwining. And the Celtic knotwork of the tree of life is also, even if you're not Celtic, is burned into our psyche as a positive archetype. Now, how do we take these archetypes and apply them to survival identity? Well, the civilized human self views him or herself as human. I am human above all other organisms, like we talked about, the hierarchy. Whereas the ecological self identifies with Gaia, living as one organism. The civilized human self views the environment as something outside of oneself, even though they are certainly directly and indirectly affected by any catastrophe on the earth. So this past year, when there were just so many fires going on all over the planet, wildfires because of climate change, people woke up to the Amazon is on fire. Australia is on fire. California is on fire in big, epic ways. From an ecological self viewpoint, like I mentioned before, the perception is my house is on fire. My home is on fire, whether you live in Australia or the Amazon or California or not. The civilized human self knows from reading or even experiencing that there are pollutants and toxins. The ecological self says, my body, my family, my community, my home is polluted with toxins. I am polluted with toxins. And of course, that is correct. Every organism on the planet is, to some effect, polluted from industrial toxins. When human beings are buried or cremated, they are designated hazardous waste because so many toxins have entered our system before we've died. The civilized human self puts a blindfold on and says, I don't really want to know that the life support systems of the environment are collapsing. The soil, the water, the oceans, the climate, biodiversity. It has been shown over and over and again that all of these major life support systems that hold everything together are in decline, are collapsing. But that's just too overwhelming. That's just too stressful. And I've got to go pick up my kids from school, and I've got to go shopping, and I've got to pay these bills. And I am in survival mode. I don't have the capacity to feel that. The ecological self acknowledges, I am aware that my interconnected life support systems are collapsing. I'm aware of that. I have grief. I feel grief. I feel anger. I feel sadness, I feel despair, and I feel love. And the love comes from the connection of knowing that we're all going through this together, that it's reality because we love life. We have a connection to life. So all of those feelings of despair and grief, they're all incredibly normal and important for us to feel. And that is a big part of what ecopsychology and ecotherapy is about. My own survival, says the civilized human self, is threatened by this virus, the virus. We humans are now at war with nature, the enemy. The ecological self acknowledges that death is a natural cycle. of renewal that affects the whole system. And the threat of survival is universal. Let's look at this diagram of the history of pandemics. It's a timeline. It's not complete by any means, but it shows way back the death toll of humans that were documented, all the way up till today. At the very bottom, you'll see the coronavirus. And the fuzzballs of these invasive, foreign, strange creatures that represent these viruses and plagues. The size of them indicate the number of the death toll, of the human death toll. And as you can see, the biggest in history was probably the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, which we're all familiar with. And way down here at the bottom, the coronavirus COVID-19 is still really relatively small in comparison to all of the rest of the pandemics. And so if you notice, there seems to be a pattern. Every few hundred years or less than 100 years, there seems to be an outbreak. There seems to be an infectious disease that takes down thousands or hundreds of thousands or sometimes millions of human beings. So this is a pattern of nature, we can say, that is consistent throughout human history. And since humans have always been here for a blip of time, for only about 200,000 years on the planet, in a 4 billion year period, we can pretty much assume that microorganisms like viruses have been a part of the system since the beginning, and that there's a lot we don't know and we don't understand. And in fact, viruses and things like that, organisms like that, are everywhere. There are trillions of viruses in the water, in the soil, in the air, in our bodies, in our digestive system. Viruses are there, but because they're so microscopic, people don't see them unless they're a scientist or looking at a microscope, or you can look at a picture on the computer. But as you can see, you can understand why in the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, they had no idea what was going on, and they blamed people, mostly women, that they didn't understand what was going on, and there was a witch hunt. There was a witch burning because people died and nobody knew why. And there were all sorts of suspicions and all sorts of, nasty things going on. And that is also a human pattern, is that we get angry and when we feel threatened, and when you're in fight or flight, you got to find some way to release that anxiety, and there's a lot of blaming going on, and there's a lot of chaos and emotions being thrown all around, and we can see that very apparently right now in what's going on in the world. What about the survival identity of the whole planet, which I seem to be talking about? Well, for instance, other organisms go through pandemics. And here's a brief history of some tree pandemics. Dutch elm disease, for example, killed over 100 million trees in the USA and Europe between the 1920s and the 1940s. Chestnut blight, another tree pandemic that you've probably heard of, that your ancestors were very aware of, killed over 4 billion trees in the USA and Europe during 1904 to 1930. And most recently, what we know in California and the west coast of the United States is called sudden oak death, Sudden oak death has killed over 1 million trees in the western USA since the 1990s to the present. These are all microscopic pathogens that are traveling around in trees and has decimated forests, you know, now by insects. So there is the largest tree forest pandemic in the history of humanity, certainly. And it's because of climate change. So climate change is drying out the forests of the world, which makes, you know, very tasty food for some of these invasive insects that have been transported all over the world because of humans. And millions of acres of forests are being killed worldwide every year, more and more increasingly, because of climate change, which is, you know, a human-induced result affecting the entire global ecosystem. Because we know that forests aren't just made up of trees. They're very, very complex ecosystems with millions of organisms, and forests help create the climate. They regulate the weather. They have to do with purifying the water and hydrology and soil, and it's all one big system, those of you who have an understanding of ecology. So when you hear about, oh, those trees are dying, oh, that's, you know, that's really too bad, and then they're going to go up in flames and stuff, but that's over there. No, 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 it all affects the entire system, the entire planetary system, which we're seeing more and more. So the survival identity of trees is really interesting. It's cooperative instead of self versus other. All of these scientific studies you've probably heard about trees communicating underground and forests communicating through the mycorrhizal fungi and the mycelium. Well, it's true that they are a cooperative different organism, and trees in danger will communicate with each other underground, sharing information and resources. It's not across the board. Of course, there's some trees that don't communicate with other trees, and some trees favor certain species. It's been shown that they favor their offspring and communities. So there's a lot we are learning about this, but just to know that this is the forest's internet, right? And just like we right now are dependent so much about technology and the internet to communicate with each other and see how we're doing and to take care of each other and tell each other we love them, and maybe we set up ways to get food delivered, you know, that's not so much different of how nature works. So in other words, nature has this system, and because we are nature, we're naturally doing this, and it's no coincidence that we created the internet to mimic nature and the mycorrhizal fungi network, which is way, way more complex than we can imagine. All right, so let's think some more about the planet's survival. Climate change, wildfires. Do you remember me? Remember those koala bears? We were just so worried about them. We just cared so much. We were making them little mittens and things to take care of them. Well, what happened to that? You know, we just, okay, that went to the back of our psyche. What about the Amazon deforestation and the burning of the Amazon and all of those animals and all of those indigenous people that are fighting for their lives? Remember those? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I remember those. Okay. Oh, remember Arctic drilling and the ice caps melting and climate change, and those polar bears are going to go extinct. Oh my God. And should we really be drilling for oil? Like, we should stop drilling for oil, right? I mean, like, all of this was in our consciousness before the pandemic started. And endangered species, you know, the tigers and the panda bears and the polar bears. Like, remember all those animals? And those are the big charismatic megafauna. So those are burned into our psyches as well. It's like, oh no, we can't lose those. We can't lose those animals. But really, endangered species goes across the board to even microorganisms, and we have no idea who is leaving the planet. Of course, we know the big ones, but we don't know the little ones. And it's been said that between 100 and 1,000 species go extinct every day. that is part of the great unraveling that is happening. But we're not paying attention to that right now. Oh, and remember the bees? Remember, we've been so worried about the bees and the pollinators, and if those colonies just completely collapse, they pollinate like 70% of our vegetable and fruit food supply, us humans, but also there's so many ecological services that the bees and the pollinators do, and they're really in trouble. And you know, that is really depressing, and I can't think about that right now because I have to put my mask on. Where's my mask? Where did I put my mask? So my big question is, are we in a state of self-distraction? Is our collective civilized identity experiencing a collective psychosis right now? We don't want to pay attention. We don't want to look. We didn't want to look before, but we certainly don't want to look now that the earth is really burning. Back to the survival identity of the humans. The civilized human self responds to all of that I just said. You know, that's really, really, really sad that all those other animals and plants and bees that they're dying, but you know, I have just got to protect myself, and I've got to save myself and my family. Our ecological self responds, there are no others. We are Gaia. Together, we are one body, one family. The question is, are we finally, as a species, feeling the survival, the threat of survival, which all other life on Earth is experiencing and has been experiencing for decades and hundreds of years? My question is, whose crisis is this? And I wonder if Gaia, the planet, is in a process of trying to rebalance herself amidst her own health crisis or our health crisis. Should we, can we resist a natural ecological cycle of Gaia, as we saw on that timeline, that these pandemics happen periodically throughout time? And they happen in nature too. Whether or not we're in a state of ecological collapse, diseases, microorganisms, they exist as part of the greater ecosystem. Do we think as humans that we can control that? This is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to embrace, fully embrace our ecological identity, to acknowledge it, to reflect on it, to embrace it, to embrace that part of ourselves that has fallen back into consciousness. It's part of our unconsciousness. And for some of us, it's very much in our consciousness. But for the majority of humans on the earth, we're not even conscious that we are the earth. So the opportunity here is to shift our perception of not only ourselves, but and the planet, but also the virus, the archetype of the threatening virus. Can we shift our perception of the virus? Can we take this crisis as an opportunity to shift from a state of emergency to a state of emergence? That we are emerging, that we are re-emerging, that the planet has the potential to re-emerge. And so I welcome you home. If you can take this challenge into your heart and your consciousness, welcome home, fellow Gaias. Thank you.
Thank you, Julianne, for your excellent presentation. We continue with Dr. Tina Fields. Hello, Tina. Dr. Tina Fields is a professor of ecopsychology at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, and IES Co-Representative for the USA. Her talk has a title COVID-19 as a Collective Rite of Passage, and illustrates how, along with the suffering, this pandemic also represents a rare opportunity for us to emerge into a more thrivable relationship with each other, the earth, and our souls, our own souls, if we can work with it consciously. Please, Dr. Tina Fields, with your presentation. Thank you.
Well, a few weeks later, the stallion comes back and he's followed by a whole herd of wild horses who have accompanied him back to the ranch. And so now this man not only has one horse, he has a whole herd of horses, and some of them are mares, and they'll be able to give foals. And so many, many horses have come to him. What great luck, said all the neighbors. What amazing luck. I can't believe your luck. And the peasant responds, maybe bad, maybe good. Who knows? We'll see. Well, one day the son was training one of these horses when the horse reared up and knocked the son over and broke his leg in a really bad way. So he would have to stay in bed for weeks, probably until he healed. And once more, here come the neighbors. Terrible, terrible. Maybe terrible, maybe not. We'll see, who knows? So shortly after that, here comes the emperor. The emperor's army entered the village saying there's a war on and we need all the young men in the village to be conscripted for the glory of the empire. And honestly, most of them would never return. But this man's son was spared because he was in bed with a broken leg. So maybe bad, maybe good. Who knows? We'll see. I'm starting with this story because we in the Industrial Growth Society are currently walking the edge of a big cultural transition. On the top, the COVID-19 pandemic is really scary, and people are naturally reacting from that place. I have 2 students slowly healing from it now. We all know others who may never heal. Some folks are working on the front lines all the time, putting themselves in danger. Others yet have lost their work, their incomes. They worry about losing their homes. Our healthcare system is not set up for healing. It's set up for profit and not accessible to everybody. It's a hard time, and it's going to get harder as the economic inequity and fear and greedy opportunism, so rampant in at least USA politics, continues to grow. Now, we've mobilized amazingly well in responding to the fast emergency that COVID-19 presents. The worldwide response to this pandemic has been really remarkable. I mean, within days, we've collectively knocked off some of our worst, most destructive environmental behaviors. The global world of commerce has suddenly ground to a snail's pace. There are nearly no airplanes in the sky, nor cars on the road. compared to with before. Who knew such a thing was even possible? And within a month, which is really short for geologic time, for Earth time, within a month, we could begin to see some interesting side effects. Air quality in China is one of them. A news article from The Guardian cited a Stanford University researcher, Marshall Burke. He found in early March, from the start of the pandemic until early March, that because of the terrible pollution that was there previously and the asthma and lung diseases that came from that, COVID-19 responses involving emissions reductions had in effect saved the lives of at least 1,400 children under 5 and almost 52,000 adults over 70. Now there's many deaths from COVID there, and yet wildly, this area might have a net gain in health from the cleaner air. It's interesting, eh? It's bad, it's good. Yes, and opportunity. And they're mutually exclusive, and yet they're both true. Holding the ability to hold ambiguity in both of our hands lightly seems pretty important these days. So I'll say psychologists look for the seeds of both problems and solutions within our own human psyches. Ecopsychologists do this in conjunction with listening to and healing the larger self too, the ecological self, the more than human world. An ecopsychological perspective can reframe this COVID-19 pandemic not only as a painful burden, but as an unprecedented opportunity to come into righter relationship with the earth, with other people, and our own souls. The mirror's turned. Because of stopping our business as usual actions, we can better see the effects of those actions on the world. Now, as a species, we face a threat much stronger and more widespread than this virus, and you all know it. Our challenge is helping our people continuing to similarly respond with this urgency to what James Kunstler calls the long emergency of climate change and pernicious toxins, growing inequalities, the ongoing damage that we're doing to our environment and our social fabric. These are the very matrices of our long-term survival. So here's the question: can we as a collective be courageous enough to approach the eventual post-COVID normalcy with a new set of guiding ethics, which are also ancient? These ethics reframing our ways to privilege life over profit. Can we do this? Because our lives might depend on it. We are at a huge cultural transition point. I work with transitions and rites of passage as part of my work. In individual lives, we witness two kinds of big life transitions. The first one is linear or situational, and the second one is transformative. Linear or situational means a change of your situation or your role. Like you get a new job. Maybe it's even a new job within the same company, but it's a change in your life. That's a transition. A transformative transition, on the other hand, is much larger. It involves a change of identity along with that. So, for example, going from a child to adolescent to young adult to elder, or from single to married, or from childless to parents. See, not only is your life really different, but your whole identity is different too, and it's pretty quick. Now, in traditional societies, these changes are supported by rituals called rites of passage. These are consciously enacted rituals that support the incorporation of the new identity amongst the group. And the idea is to help ensure an optimal outcome for everybody. The new person knows their role. Everybody is supported more by that person being held by it. The stages of rites of passage, as observed cross-culturally long ago by anthropologists Van Gennep and Turner, and these are commonly practiced in wilderness quests today, are severance, threshold or liminal space, and return and reincorporation. Severance is where we're clearly in severance phase now, I'll just say. That is where you are preparing to die to an old way of life that no longer suits you. that no longer serves us, rather. You gather resources needed for the journey. And so in our case, there was a lot of hoarding of TP, right? And then knowing that the unknown awaits. We don't know what's on the other side of that. We're about to cross the threshold and we don't know. And that unknown is part of the fear and excitement of the severance phase. After that, you cross the threshold, you're in liminal space where you still don't know, but you're in it. You're threshing, literally being threshed. And finally, a new self comes clear, usually through the support of an intention, and you return to incorporate this new self. You return to your community as this new self. Now that's the hero's journey model, collected all over the place by male anthropologists who got to witness. Abigail Brenner came up with that. She observed repeating stages in women's rites of passage that were a little bit different. And so this approach involves 3 phases of enclosure, metamorphosis or magnification, and emergence. Enclosure is similar to severance. That's where the women will go into some kind of special area, like a cave or a hut specially constructed for this, like a red tent, for example, for menstruation rituals. And there, for the larger rites of passage, then the person undergoes a metamorphosis where she liquefies the parts of herself that she doesn't need, like a butterfly would, and grows the parts that she will need, the parts that are truest and deepest in her soul, the wings, magnification of the deepest parts of the soul, and then eventually emerges, of course, and again incorporates. So the point of rites of passage, no matter which model you're using, is that change can bring opportunity if it is supported, especially by conscious intention. You go in with an intention. So otherwise, you're just kind of thrown around by it all and frightened and not understanding. It's good to have a structure, which is why I'm presenting this to you. I hope it'll be useful. I find it quite interesting how our collective governmentally mandated shelter-in-place responses to COVID echoes these intentional structures that are set up across many traditional cultures for supporting a big transition in a person's life. And a key factor to keep in mind in traditional cultures too is that the rite of passage doesn't just happen to the individual. It starts there, but it's also a process of initiation intimately involving one's community, whom that person is now expected to serve from their new identity. In this case, I mean, I have this wild idea that one can question, are we somehow being led by Gaia in this way, by the earth in this way? I'll come back to that. One of the greatest joys in my ecopsychology career has been to work with contemporary wilderness rites of passage, with people from just regular folks in the United States. After days of preparatory ceremony, I send people out into the wilderness alone, that is without contact with other living beings. One could question whether we can ever actually be alone on this living planet, in this living planet. Anyway, they're sent out without other human beings. They fast without food for 3 days and nights, and they go with an intention to guide them. I think some of my participants are actually here who have been on these trips with me, and so you know your time out there isn't always easy. There might be freezing wet weather. There might be bugs. There might be bears. There are bears, mountain lions. And when they return from the wilderness, we guides, we call ourselves guides. Aries writing so many bugs. Lightning. When they return, the guides hear and mirror elements of their stories, their experiences back to them. We listen very deeply, not just from the head, but from the heart, as if we had an ear right here on the heart. We're not, the words might be imperfect, but what's underneath it? And one of the things we listen for is the deeper and even mythological dimension beyond the events themselves. Something larger that illustrates or confirms the soul's deep longings. When suffering's been involved, then whether inner or outer, there's a lot of inner turmoil too as you're threshing your soul around, right? No matter if there's suffering been involved, we seek to find what's called the gift in the wound. The gift in the wound. Love that phrase. So in this case, what's the wound? I mean, the field of ecopsychology exists because of the wound, right? Because many humans now feel disconnected from the matrix of our survival, our earth, our water, our air, each other, animals. Due to our choices to privilege private economic gain over environmental thrivability, humanity is at the threshold of the 6th great global extinction, leading to much greater suffering and death than this virus is going to cause. Sheltering in place gives us a pause. We can use it consciously rather than just watching videos all the time. I mean, some is good, but a pause, a chance to step back and see more clearly in wider perspective the effects of our actions within the industrial growth society on ourselves, on the earth, in our relationships with each other. This glimpse into the mirror of the cleaner air, the animals returning, the quiet, what we can hear now. I hear birds right now, I hear frogs right now. I didn't hear them before. This is a glimpse into the world as it could be if we changed our world, our ways for good. And that mirror offers us a chance to more likely correct our course. All right, now I'm going to step back and ask you, what stage of development do you think humanity as a whole is in right now? I mean, when you look at human behavior around the world, especially in the industrial growth society, and then you imagine our species as one individual, how old would that person be? Would they be a toddler? Would they be a teenager? A young adult? A middle-aged adult? A wise elder? I wish I could see everybody. Raise your hands. What do you think, Cleo and Flor? Teenager, writes Holly. I'll give you a moment if you want to respond. This is fun.
For me, it's a teenager.
Teenager.
I would say.
What about you, Flor? Young adult, says Adriana. Well, when Dwayne Elgin asked this question back in the 1990s, he asked it all over the world, kind of like we're doing right here. And back then, 2/3 said teenager. They said adolescent. And I've been asking this question for the last 20 years as well. And more recently, a lot of people also say toddler. But nobody says wise elder. Nobody. Unless you're talking, of course, about indigenous cultures alone. But, that's a little different story. We're talking humans as a whole, including all of us, the mass of us in the industrial growth society. Teenager or toddler, yeah. I actually had a dream last night. I know it's edgy, but I'm going to share it. That we were toddlers around Mother Earth, sweet Mother Earth. And we were toddling around her knees, and she was saying to us, "Don't squeeze the kitten's neck so hard, honey." And she was gently prying our sticky fingers away to relieve her other children's suffering. Toddler or adolescent, not wise elder. But this is actually good news because it means we're on the verge of collectively growing up. This shift to a more mature perspective could bring a radically different and positive future. That's what Dwayne Elgin said back then, and it's still true because adults and elders care for their people and their places so that life might continue. That's their role. That's our role. We just need to step up into it, and we can. This is the beautiful opportunity to have this self-witnessing and to do it. All right, supports. What does ecopsychology have to offer along these lines? Well, in the wild, we have experienced elders guiding those going through the rites of passage. There's lots of tools, preparatory rituals, time alone in nature, deep listening, as I said, and then the eventual careful return to their own home communities. I'll offer a few strategies. One is societal actions, of course. Jane Goodall recently pointed out that COVID was brought here because of bad relationship with the more than human world. We got it because we have been encroaching on wild animals' territories and then using their meat for production, wet markets of bushmeat. And then viruses more easily jump the species barrier and get spread by our widespread global air travel. And so it's an opportune moment for us to come back into right relationship by questioning our consumption levels, or our perceived needs of things that maybe we don't need, and find alternative solutions that don't encroach so much on other beings' livelihood. There's other individual behavior that supports this change. My partner, Ed, found out that actually his company is enhancing productivity by not having everybody drive in for meetings or fly in for meetings. They can just do it from home and then they're done. Bam. That's pretty sweet. So no commute, no driving, no flying, no fossil fuels that way. And then consumerism, easy. I found out, there's no toilet paper. I found out, you know what? Hello, I don't need toilet paper. I don't need it when I'm out in the field. I can use a rag. I can use water. I can, there's other alternatives to do this, which is quite liberating. And I don't think I'll go back. Maybe that's an overshare. But these kinds of things we can think about. What do we really need versus what are we used to using and thinking we need? We really don't. And the big reframe that putting humans back in rightful places, one plain humble being among other beings, not one that should be in charge, an I-thou relationship with all the other species and the earth as a whole. Again, like First Nations people have been doing successfully for millennia. Move back to that. Now in EcoSarc, one of our great loves is nature connection. And another thing that's important to do right now is to regulate our nervous systems, to come into right relationship with other people, right? To share things and not hoard and check in on your neighbors and all this, but it's hard to do when you're in fear. It's hard not to just think about yourself and your survival. It's natural. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We're going to look for our survival. One of my students recently was doing a project where she was trying to eliminate the use of single-use plastics, but when COVID hit, she was terrified. She's in New York City. She bought tons of food and throwaway containers because she was afraid of the contamination. She wanted to get rid of it. And then she felt ashamed, but she understood. And so we have to make sure people feel safe and cared for. And there's techniques for feeling calm and centered. Let's go to the next slide. Nature is one of the known ways, we're looking at healing here, one of the known ways of dealing with traumatic stress. This is a chart showing the window of tolerance, it's Dr. Porges' polyvagal theory about how nervous systems react when they're in trauma. But then it was taken and made more accessible here for people to use. And this is what happens to us when we're confronted with something traumatic. We find it difficult to be out of the normal range. I don't know how to put an arrow. You see that middle bit where it says normal range? That's where a person has maximum capacity for responding in a good way, a way that doesn't wig you out. When we get hit with a traumatic event, one of two things happens, especially if it happens over and over and over. That's what that red line is. It happens over and over. And at first you can handle it and then you can't. This is why long emergencies are so difficult. So you have a traumatic event, you're in the middle, you're fine, but then you might get whacked out and stuck on, as they put it, up above. And what happens there is you're just on overload, you're anxious, you're frightened, you maybe get hyperactive. Any little thing will hit you and freak you. You're restless, you're hypervigilant, you might not be able to digest properly, you might not sleep well, and you react to input usually with defensive hostility rather than being able to deal with it. Like, oh, that really wasn't a big deal. It feels like a big deal, whatever it is, for a moment, if you're in that state, and you can't help it. Your nervous system is doing that. You can't help it. And conversely, the other way is the stuck on off down on the bottom, that blue part. You can see yourself in these. I'm sure I'm usually stuck on off if I get whacked over too much. And that's where I'm just out of here. You go into lethargy. You want to sleep a lot. You might be disoriented. You don't digest well. You might dissociate. It's just kind of flat, like the whole world becomes a little bit flat and you can't deal. And what you want to do is withdraw. And so often what we want to do is to develop the capacity for sticking in the middle, having the normal range, or getting more quickly back into the normal range when things happen that are difficult for us. And several things that have been known to do this, according to a lot of research, are mindfulness meditation, therapy, and our favorite, time in nature. The more than human world will do this. So these nature connection exercises aren't just fluffy fun, let's go hang out with the bunnies. These are also really serious interventions for the trauma created by the industrial growth society. And if we're going to make changes, we're going to have the capacity to sit with hardness, to sit with difficulty as it comes and not be thrown around by it. An epidemic of fear is probably going to cause more than the virus is, you know, if we turn against each other more, especially for the vulnerable people. So this is not small. Another thing we can do is, I'll give the last strategy and then I'll stop. The last strategy that I'll offer you is to try to reframe the story of what I can't do to what I can do, from crisis to opportunity, from oppression to opportunity. So for example, if you were planning on doing a long international travel, you might feel really bummed. I didn't get to do that. I didn't get to see my relatives in Greece, or which would be, you know, or I didn't get to have that trip, or I didn't get to do this retreat, or whatever it is you were thinking of doing. This is a chance. This is a chance to re-inhabit our own home places, explore our own home places very deeply, get to know them, come to belong to your place, get to know that tree outside your door like a lover. Find out what bugs live there. I'm gonna share a URL at the end for a bioregional quiz. This is a very old thing, but I've extended it. It's an old thing that basically started as a quiz called Where Are You At? And it was intended to help people understand, well, your home place, right? It has questions like, where does the water in your house come from? Trace it from rainfall to tap, and where did the cloud gather its moisture? Even thinking about that kind of expands relationship with your place, doesn't it? Here's another. When your garbage is thrown away, where is away? Go walking around and find out. And Julianne's favorite would be name 7 common trees in your area. Which ones are native? For the others, how did they get here? Why were they brought here? And the last one I would offer is, how recently was the moon full? Do you know how recently the moon was full? Do you know what phase she's in now? If you don't know, don't look it up on Google. Go outside tonight, and go outside tomorrow night, and the next night, and the next night, and then notice how the phases of the moon affect you as well. Because it will. So, ultimate ecopsychological goals for our collective rite of passage, you know, like, I'll be nerdy and do a Star Trek term, to make long-term planetary thrivability our prime directive, privileging the health and happiness of nature and people over private economic gain, and to help us navigate the times with more equanimity, grace, and kindness. And we have to fight our politicians, you know? I mean, some of the regulations are being relaxed to protect the wallets from the virus. It's short-term thinking. It will ultimately cause much more harm than help. When I think about this, I have a dream image, the last one, of us feeling a bit cold. And so, hey, let's just cut down the wall. I dreamed this. Let's cut down the walls of our house one by one. We can build a fire with the walls one by one, right? Until the roof caves in on us. We're not foreseeing that the roof will fall. We have to make our politicians hold the roof up. So we have a choice. This is the moment. People, my friends, my comrades, we have a choice collectively, and all of us here are catalysts for helping others make that choice, to realize it's a good choice, not a deprivation, but a joy. I hope this presentation has given you a little insight into the pandemic, not only as a painful burden, but as an opportunity to come into righter relationship. If we as a collective can be courageous enough to approach that eventual return to normalcy by reframing normal as something different. Let's focus our psycho-spiritual intention and gird our activist loins to collectively come through this, oh, I need the next slide, please. Come through this transitional passage incorporated, no, one after that, as functional adults. And better yet, with the help and advice from the more than human world as our wise elders, because our collective survival depends on it. I thank you for standing with me, all of us together, along with Mother Earth, in this endeavor. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Tina. All what you said were very interesting. And of course, there was no way of make it more minimal. And thank you for that. So, Andrian, Karen is is thanking for the presentation and asks if there are any books on eco-psychology that you would recommend.
This is a reference list. And Adriana, my favorite book on eco-psychology is the first one that was ever collected. It's called Eco-Psychology, Restoring the Earth, Healing the Mind. And it's a compilation that was made in the 90s, and I still think it's the best. It's the best introduction. I love it. And of course, there's much, much more since then. There's, you know, if you want Eco-Psychology Journal articles, that's out there. You know, there's ecotherapy work being done. There's forest medicine work. It depends on what your interest is. The field is so broad, you know, there's many different opportunities. So take a picture of that if you want it, folks, and then I'll go back and I'll share the bioregional quiz link, which that's on my own little blog, and you're totally welcome to take it and use it. And if you do, please tell me the things that you learn. When you do the bioregional quiz, which is another ecopsychological strategy, a profound one I found, take it as not, oh my God, I don't know anything. Take it as, again, a yes. Try to approach all these things as a yes. Wow, all these amazing things I have yet to learn. Fantastic. And then add more.
Tina, we also have another question. How will we witness and share our understanding of the potential transformation of this time with others who may not understand in the same way?
I would approach it by what they need, you know? I mean, the strategies that you can bring just by your way of being, I think are very important. Like offering them deep listening. Listen to them, listen to where they're at, and this will help them calm. Take them outside and help them connect with the more than human world who will help them heal. And if we're talking about, are you talking about just the basic need to shift our way of life? There's an awful lot of evidence that we are heading for the 6th great extinction. And you know, some folks, I don't know if you know about the activist 80-10-10, where there's a spectrum. If you're talking to people about any issue whatsoever, there's 80-10-10. So you've got 10% of the people on one end are always going to do the right thing according to their viewpoint on that issue. Like, for example, let's do a simple one that's aligned with recycling. Even when recycling was very difficult, people like me would do it no matter what. I don't care how difficult or expensive, I'm doing it. It seemed to be useful then. And then on the other end, there's 10% who are going to say, that is just stupid. I am not doing that. I'm not getting my hands dirty. I don't care what affected it. Forget it. But there's 80% in the middle who are in a spectrum along that line. And those people are swayable. And so if you find yourself talking to somebody who says climate change is a myth, don't waste your time. You know, that's the 10%. But if they say, I suspect it's a myth, then you can talk about it. You can try to show them some of the data. You can educate them. And maybe there's other issues besides climate change. I mean, I've noticed that pernicious toxins affect people because that's tied in with their children's health. People want their children to be healthy and to live long lives. So that's one way to approach that, and then help them make small changes in their own lives. So for example, it's overwhelming, right, at first. And so you could find alternatives to really poisonous cleaners that are based in chemicals that came out of World War II. A lot of our pesticides and cleaners and things like that are based in chemicals that came out of warfare. There's no wonder that they harm us. We really need to use products that don't harm beings. And so you can help people find these alternatives, which are also cheaper. So that's another win, right? And also less plastic, which is the third win. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
So thank you all of you, and hope to see you in our next ones. For more information, you can visit our Facebook of International Ecopsychology Society and our webpage www.ies.po. Thank you, all of you.
Theo, thank you. Thank you.